G'day guys, back at the Outer Circle, and today I just want to talk quickly about how I'm assessing units in the Horus Heresy. So obviously this channel is not about trying to find the most dick kicker, most powerful lists. The whole point of our Getting Started in the Horus Heresy series is for people who want to play games of the Horus Heresy from a narrative standpoint. You want to play with your friends, you want to have fun, and the lists you create are got to be viable. That's one of the key criteria. Now, where does this stem from and how does this work? So it goes back to my 5th edition Warhammer 40,000 Days. And it has to do with things like power creep. So in my mind, every faction should have numerous playstyles and play to their tropes especially well. And they should all be roughly as good as one another. And I think that's a pretty fair prerequisite. And of course, what we got in that time period of 5th edition 40k was we had a clear power gap between the top tier and the bottom tier. And we see that same distinction in the Horus Heresy today, where there is a clear power distinction. And this makes games more unenjoyable. Now, there are plenty of people out there who are happy to lose and lose every game, and just putting models on the table is enough for them. But for most people, in my experience, what they find most satisfying is the nail biter. The game that goes down to the wire and either player could have won it at either time. There is nothing worse than a steamroll for a lot of people because, well, you often don't have as much fun. It's as simple as that. And with that in mind, when I look at the legions, okay, what is apparently all out of stock at the moment because, okay, reasons. When I look at these legions here, I see some clear power discrepancies when I look through their rules. And it's not to say that if you pick up, for example, Imperial Fists, you are going to win every game, because you're not. However, the Imperial Fists have all the tools available to them as a legion to win every game. And that's why I come down very harshly on the legion. If you look at someone like the Imperial Fists, as an example, you have good, solid ranged war gear in the form of assault cannons, which are widely available to the Legion. Yes, you pay points for them, but they are an excellent weapon, that's why you're paying points for them. And you're not paying so many points as to make them unviable. They also have access to Vigil Pattern Storm Shields, an excellent defensive option. On top of that, they have 3 Rites of War, which is more than most legions, and 2 of them are just excellent for the Imperial Fists, buffing their already incredible survivability with little to no drawbacks when it comes to their hard-hitting firepower. And therefore, when I look at the Legion, that is all the tools they need to succeed in games of the Horus Heresy. When you look at another Legion, let's pick a pretty bad one. Let's go with the Thousand Suns. On the one hand, the ability to have psychic praetors and characters is incredibly strong. If they get the right combination of abilities and war gear, they are an incredible force on the battlefield, halfway between a real praetor and a primarch. Fantastic. However, the rest of the army has poor war gear options, where you have very questionable war gear in the form of their ether fire weaponry, which it can work in very specific circumstances, okay? Which, again, someone like the Imperial Fists do not need to generate extenuating circumstances, they just have the correct circumstances at all times. The Thousand Suns are also hampered by their Legion trait. The Legion trait only applies to Psychers. They're the only ones who are able to pull off the ability and to affect their squads. This means that if the squads lose their sergeants, that the squads are now unable to access their basic Legion trait. So you compare that very situational bonus of having to try and pull the trait off each turn as an ability, and they're not generally very good abilities either, the Thousand Suns traits. Again, versus the other extreme, which is the Imperial Fists, who, with all their bolt and auto weapons, which is, realistically, 3/4 of the weapons you're going to see in most games, with all of those weapons, they're at +1 on their to-hit rolls. This is not a modification of the ballistic skill, it's a flat +1 to hit. It affects snap shooting because of that, because it's a modifier on their roll, not a modifier to their ballistic skill, which cannot be increased in snap shooting. So one Legion has a lot of tools the other does not. And this is hugely important for how we rank the legions, and when we look at them for gameplay purposes on the tabletop. And Games Workshop has created a terrible imbalance here, where it feels like they basically got different writers and gave each of them a few legions, and then none of them spoke to each other during the design process, and that's how you ended up with such disparate levels of power. We also see this approach when it comes to weapons. Some weapons are just disproportionately strong, probably because the people who created the game didn't think of the flow-on consequences of designing those weapons. And I don't say this to insult the people who actually wrote the game, okay? Take a step back from the crazy Maka character for a moment, and I'll talk with you as a real individual. If you're creating a game and you want to add something like reactions in, okay? Reactions are often range-based, especially for things like shooting reactions. So it now becomes advantageous for you to have greater range than your opponents. I think we can all agree on that. Because if you can shoot further than them, they cannot react to your shooting. Now, if you followed me this far, what happens when you have something like Nemesis bolt weapons, okay? These are bolt guns which have 72 inches of range. That's the length of a 6-foot long table, the long length. That is a huge amount of range, and it is available on troops choices, on veterans, on seekers, on all of the characters basically. So you have an incredibly long ranged weapon which is very widely available. Now you take this weapon and you give it the ability that it can select the model that the wounds are allocated against, and the person who is taking the wounds has no recourse against this. They must take the wounds on their chosen model unless there is a special rule such as on the Deathwing Companions. This combined with the fact that squad sergeants are so vital in the Horus Heresy for giving things like leadership, and in the case of some like the Thousand Sons, their actual traits. If you make a weapon widely available which is able to select that sergeant out of the squad as the target and then put multiple shots into them, at some point very quickly they're going to fail their armor saves. And this is exacerbated by the amount of rending weapons that are available in the game. Now amplify this again with either a legion like, say, the Imperial Fists, who have a higher ballistic skill essentially because they're going to hit on 2s with these weapons thanks to the +1 to hit modifier. Or a legion like the Night Lords, who could potentially shoot you with these weapons, and not only can they do it from a range you might not be able to respond to, but even if you could, there might be negative modifiers on you such as night fighting, which are going to affect your return fire or your response in general to them. These consequences were not very well thought out, and therefore you have to take things like war gear into heavy consideration when you're ranking the legions. Again, this is where we look at someone like the Imperial Fists. There are other legions who I would call weak, like the Raven Guard, who if you kit them out in such a way as to capitalize on the things that are their strength, such as a sniper heavy force, they'll be incredibly strong. However, are they strong to the degree that they are able to overcome someone like the Imperial Fists? My belief is no. They have incredible tools available to them in that regard, but the Imperial Fists, again, have more tools in their arsenal. So if you're playing a one-on-one game, you bring Raven Guard, sniper veterans, and the Imperial Fists bring sniper veterans, then it's down to the intangibles, the other things that you're bringing to the table. If they're bringing Phalanx Warders and their Rite of War, where those Phalanx Warders are going to get rerollable invul saves on a 4+, and Feel No Pain of 4+, and you're bringing, I don't know, Raven Guard Tactical Marines, okay, you're at a distinct disadvantage there. I know that's a very extreme and poor example, but those are the kind of things you're going to see. We also have to look at other factors, such as, let's take the Space Wolves as an example. You have a legion there with excellent mobility and no drawbacks essentially to that. I'm a key believer that one of the things that Horus Heresy got really right, which 2.0 has not done well, is drawbacks. Heresy 1 had significant drawbacks, and it came with just picking the legion. So, for example, Raven Guard. When you picked the Raven Guard Legion, you could not have more vehicles than you had no more vehicles than infantry choices. Apologies. With the Legiones Astartes Raven Guard special rule. This was very important because it meant no matter what Rite of War you used, no matter what kind of list you build, that restriction was always there because you were Raven Guard. And it meant that it kind of pigeonholes you a little bit towards the Raven Guard playstyle. but it gave you excellent bonuses that capitalize on this. Contrast this with 2.0. Those kind of negative drawbacks are usually restricted to rights of war. You can take whatever units you like in most armies, in most situations. Obviously, there are traitor and loyalist restricted units, but someone like the Raven Guard is allowed to go for a very tank-heavy force. And sure, there are plenty of ways to justify it, that's fine, but it does mean that the legions are all starting from a more level playing field in that regard, and it means that the difference, being their legion tactics, becomes ever more obvious than it did in previous editions. So again, the legions which have that capitalize on it more. And when you also factor in that legion vehicles, dreadnoughts, all that kind of thing are also benefiting from legion special rules, then you have to also add that in as another extenuating factor. So regular Imperial Fists hitting you on a 2 with a bolt gun is not something to be concerned about. But would we not agree that if you have, say, a Predator battle tank with a Predator autocannon and 3 assault cannons, and hitting your entire army on 2s is quite nasty? There are ways to really farm that to the extreme. An example I might give is in a 1750 point Imperial Fist armoured spearhead list. You could go for a Sicaran battle tank with 3 assault cannons and a heavy bolter, and either 3 squads of 3 Predators with assault cannons and a Predator autocannon, or 2 squads of 5 Predators with 3 assault cannons and a Predator autocannon on each. It is 184 shots per turn. I think all but 4 heavy bolter shots are rending. Everything hits on 2s, everything will wound Marines on 2s, everything will rend on 5s or 6s. There are, again, things that can modify that. Most of it's hitting on rending on 6s, I should say. And of course, the Sicaran battle tank leading them is your HQ choice in that rite of war. That is an incredibly powerful rite of war, which, believe it or not, is surprisingly difficult to take down, because the sheer amount of firepower and the limited amount of reactions one can get each turn means you will unlikely to be actually able to stop them from utilizing that firepower before they steamroll you. But there are ways to do it. That's a very simple, easy list to construct, which can do an awful lot of damage. And it's mostly down to the Legion traits, because you couldn't pull that off with another Legion. The closest you could come is perhaps Blood Angels. But the Blood Angels will have the same option for the assault cannons, but they won't have the hitting you on +1 to hit. That's important, because instead of hitting you on 2s, they're hitting you on 3s. So they're getting a significant, I think it's about 12%, give or take, a reduction in the amount of firepower it's hitting in the first place, and then a correlating amount to wound. Then you go on to other legions. So, for example, if you are the Raven Guard, you're going to get no bonuses on your vehicles. So in a one-on-one fight, points for points, yep, they're going to spend so many points on assault cannons that you're going to get a free Predator in your Raven Guard. That is not enough to turn the tide, however. So that is all things that factor into how I'm rating legions. Another legion that I haven't spoken about in the Getting Started series yet is the Iron Warriors. Now, the Iron Warriors capitalize on their shooting to the extreme, because they have so many shooting buffs, especially in the anti-tank realm, and they have excellent heavy support options in the form of things like Tyrants, that they really are, like Imperial Fist, jacks of all trade. Dominator Cohort is another good option for them, because the brutal Thunderhammers in bulk, all of these things affect the game. And so those legions that have those tools to do so many different things are going to rate higher. But the most important thing to note here is that no matter how strong some of these factions are, they are none of them auto-win factions. They won't just win games because you're picking the strongest legion, because that gap between strongest and weakest is very real, but it's not the end of the world, and there are ways of playing around it, and smart players will capitalize on it. A good example will be Imperial Fists. Yes, they've got that awesome firepower, so do Iron Warriors. What happens when they go up against Night Lords who pull night fighting on them? Now, there's a reason I rate the Night Lords so highly, and it's because of their way to manipulate night fighting and yet not be affected by it themselves. that is a force multiplier, and it's very hard to quantify when you are coming up with these things, so you have to try and pay special attention to them when I create these videos. And I make mistakes along the way as well, which doesn't help in these videos, but I do try my hardest to get them correct. And I have a logic and a reason to why I come up with the calls I do. A good example of that would be salamanders. People will look at salamanders on the surface and think, wow, strength 6 flamers are really good, for example, and they've got access to a lot of them. But on the other hand, when you compare it to the wider game, you go, okay, what are the sort of units you're going to hit with flamers? Well, it's unlikely to be things like tactical squads because they're a second or third line unit. The thing that comes towards you first is going to be, say, dreadnoughts and Death Stars. Death Stars referring to obviously a Primarch and their bodyguard, or a Praetor and their bodyguard, which is usually the strongest, most powerful unit of Terminators inside the biggest, nastiest Spartan. Those Terminators are for the most part pretty much immune to the Flamers. Therefore, the Flamers become a lot more situational as a weapon, because in Heresy 1, you could saturate a unit of Terminators. Let's say you cause 30 wounds on a unit of 10 Terminators. Out of 30 wounds, on average, they're going to roll 5 ones. That's going to half the strength of the Terminator squad. Fantastic. But in Heresy 2.0, if you cause 30 wounds on 10 Terminators by saturating with Flamers, you're probably only going to cause, well, if you're lucky, 1 wound in the end, because they're going to get a 2-up rerollable armor save, and even if somehow a wound gets through, it's only going to take 1 of the 2 wounds off the Terminator. So you're going to be left still facing 10 Terminators. So the weapon is extremely bad compared to Heresy 1. And yet one could make the point that they probably wrote the rules with Heresy 1 in mind for a lot of what they did. And the utility of things like Flamers is also somewhat down because, well, Overwatch is a reaction now. And therefore there is a limited number of those that you can pull off in each phase. So that is part of why Salamanders ranked so badly. And on top of that, you've got to again look at Specialist War Gear, because it is the force multiplier and part of the difference between legions. It's traits, War Gear, and then second to that comes Warlord traits and then Rites of War. So a legion like the Raven Guard, they've got ever so slightly better lightning cores in the Raven's Talons. They rend a little bit better, a little bit easier than regular lightning cores. That's their special weapon. Whereas you go over to Imperial Fists, you've got Solarite Gauntlets and Vigil Pattern Storm Shields. One increases your lethality, one increases your survivability. That's a big difference. And you get this with many other legions. World Eaters, they have a host of Cutare weapons, but you wouldn't take them. And they have one of the worst upgrades I've ever seen in all of Warhammer, which is the upgrade to allow your characters to join units like, say, the Red Butchers. That upgrade is the equivalent of your Praetor putting a power drill to his head and then squeezing the trigger and letting it do the rest. It may be thematic in that regard, because that's essentially what the Butcher's nails are doing, but it makes the model so much worse, so it makes it hard to play to your theme, and that's really what kills the enjoyment. If you can't play Raven Guard as sneaky biggies who infiltrate in and, do their thing, but instead you have to play them as long-range fire support that's essentially Iron Warriors across the other side of the battlefield using sniper rifles from 72 inches, or being pseudo-Blood Angels and running forward as just, I bought 3 squads of Dark Furies and I intend to use them all, then that kind of limits your playstyle as Raven Guard, and you're going to enjoy them less for it. And that sucks. Also, this, again, it happens with other legions. Let's say you're playing the Thousand Suns. You're not going to run a whole bunch of Kennetai Blade Occult because, well, they suck. You're going to spend a lot of points and they're going to die very quickly to equivalent elite units in other armies. Meanwhile, if you go some factions, like Imperial Fists, you're not going to be let down by taking Templar Brethren or by taking Phalanx Warders. Yeah, Phalanx Warders don't hit as hard as other specialist units do, because they only have 1 attack each. And Templar Brethren, their power swords are rending, but that's not enough to rely on, is it now, for damage output? But both units are still viable, and you have the option with that legion of being good at close combat. You have the option of being good at ranged combat. And you have the option of being able to pull off many different tactics with them. You can do drop pod assaults. They have the ability to do Terminator teleport attacks, for example. That's something the Raven Guard and the Blood Angels don't have. And I think the Night Lords also lost teleport transponders off the top of my head. So Imperial Fists have all the tools. again, that's why I feel it's so strong to reiterate the point that I'm making in this video, because it's something we're seeing time and time again with these legions. And as we get towards the pointy end of the stick, we are really getting into the stronger legions now. The only exception in the videos that I've left to do at this point of recording, I haven't finished off White Scars. I haven't put up Space Wolves yet. Space Wolves are incredibly strong. Emperor's Children are incredibly strong. Iron Warriors are incredibly strong. And Dark Angels are strong, but not as strong as people give them credit for. Dark Angels have flexibility thanks to their Hexagamaton. But the Hexagamaton is a weaker version of other Legions' traits. So it is a buff, it is a bonus that they're always going to get, and it is a flexible bonus. However, it is a weaker bonus on a squad-for-squad basis. So they have a +1 to hit with all bolt weapons, essentially, but it's not as good as Imperial Fists one. It's only bolt pistols, bolt guns, that kind of thing, you see. So, again, they've got the tools, and they have some good specialist units, and one kind of weird one. But they don't have everything they need. So, yeah, that's how we rank these legions for power and for playstyle. So all things like this are taken into account when we do the getting started videos. Anyway, that's it. That's all from me, Mac with the Outer Circle. I hope you got something out of this episode. I'm sorry for not putting up more content. I'm just really flat out with real life. And it does come first, guys. I do apologize for that, but I hope to get more content out soon. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate it, and I'll see you all on the next one.